So by way of an introduction, I am Rain Sherlock and I'm the evaluation manager here at TASO. And I've been working on this small n guidance and the small n project for over 12 months or so now. And I'm joined today by Professor Chris Fox from Manchester Metropolitan University, who's been the PI or the principal investigator on the project, and also Julian Crockford from Sheffield Hallam University. Chris, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Rain. Yeah, hello, everybody. So I'm Chris Fox, Professor of Evaluation and Policy Analysis at Manchester Metropolitan University. I head up the Policy Evaluation and Research Unit here. We do evaluation, particularly impact evaluation across the public sector. And in this project, I've been leading quite a lot of the work on the guidance document, which I'd imagine some of you have probably had a chance to look at.
Thank you, Chris. And Julian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm a student experience evaluating researcher at Sheffield Hallam University. I joined the project to support Chris and Rain, primarily because I have a fair amount of experience of evaluating in the sector. And although I started with not so much familiarity with these methodologies, hopefully I was able to bring a sense of how it might land and how it could be translated into practice that we can adapt and use in our context.
Great, thank you. So in a moment, I'm going to give us just a very brief introduction or overview of TASO. I'm sure many of you on the call are familiar with that by now. I'm then going to give you, again, quite a brief background to the project and the phases that we've been through so far. I'm then going to hand over to Chris and Julian, who will give a kind of 40-minute or so presentation on the introduction to both the guidance, but also more generally to the kind of theoretical and practical considerations of conducting impact evaluation with small cohorts. And then finally, I will wrap up by giving you what I hope is quite a kind of hands-on practical intro to how to actually access the guidance, so where it sits on our website and how you can use it and interact with it. As I mentioned, we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the session, so please do drop your questions in the Q&A function as we go. So we, again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, so I won't spend ages on it, but we are an independent hub for evaluation professionals here at TASO. We've been running for over 2 years now. We produce all sorts of evaluation guidance, toolkits, research guides, and we're really here to work with the sector and help kind of capacity build and generally improve the standard of evidence across the HE sector, and work with you in order to do that. We're an independent charity, so we were incubated by King's College London, the Behavioural Insights team, and Nottingham Trent University. We have now spun out and we exist as an independent charity in the Evidence Quarter based in London. We're also an affiliate What Works centre, so there are about 9 of these centres that work with the government to try and increase the standard and kind of rigour of evidence that's used to build government policy across the board. And you can see at the bottom here that we are currently funded by the Office for Students, and that funding has been running from 2019 and currently runs until 2023. So our vision is to eliminate equality gaps in higher education, and our mission is to do this by improving the lives of young people through evidence-informed practice in higher education. So generally, these evaluation webinars that we run, and you might have attended one before, are focused on the kind of evidence generation side. So how can we work with the sector to generate more robust and better quality evidence, which is very much what today's session is going to focus on. I often present this slide at the beginning of a session because I find it quite useful to situate us in TASO's evaluation cycle. So we think of evaluation as kind of iterative, which is something that's demonstrated in the kind of circular motion of this diagram. So you kind of start with the diagnose phase, building a theory of change and trying to understand what it is you want to affect or impact. And we then come to the plan phase, which is about choosing your research methodology, your research questions, and basically setting up how you're going to conduct that research or evaluation. Today's session is very much situated in that stage 2, the plan stage, but a little bit of a divergence from our kind of regular webinar content in that we're specifically focusing on small cohorts today. And that's exactly what this guidance aims to do. There will then be future webinars on the kind of measure phase. So this is about data collection and analysis, and then of course reflect, which is more about dissemination and report writing and how we can share our findings and kind of mobilize the knowledge that comes from the evaluation and research that we do. So a kind of brief intro to the Small N project generally. You kind of saw a moment ago that our mission is to improve lives through evidence-informed practice, and we align with the OFS standards of evidence, as I'm sure many people on this call do. And I always find it helpful to come back to this and kind of understand where we are, what the lay of the land is. And I think at the moment, we've definitely got a lot of sort of what we would call type 1 or narrative level evidence. So we're really, I think as a sector, really doing quite well at producing theories of change, at reflecting on what we're doing to work towards actualizing or realizing the outcomes of that theory of change. I think we've got some type 2, and again, I think we're getting better at this. So we generally are getting better at collecting data, building ourselves kind of comparator groups, and just looking at empirical data collection more broadly. But I do think this type 3, the kind of what we would call causal evidence, is still a missing part of the puzzle. So conducting evaluation and research that allows us to really understand cause and effect. So what impact has an intervention had on outcomes for students? And historically, or to date, we have been quite focused on generating causal evidence using randomized control trials or quasi-experimental studies. The kind of, I guess, the so-called counterfactual form of evaluation, where we're able to conduct ourselves some kind of control or comparative group. But today, what we're going to be looking at is, again, a kind of divergence from those methodologies and how we can work specifically with smaller cohorts. And there are a few challenges that many people within the higher education sector or many institutions face when thinking about how to produce causal evidence and how to conduct randomized control trials or quasi-experimental studies. The first and perhaps the most salient, I guess, is the small sample sizes. So you might have a small specialist provider that works as a music school or an arts college or even like a veterinary science school. And the cohorts that provider works with will be generally inherently quite small. So you're only ever going to have a cohort of kind of 30 or 40 and not into the hundreds, and probably certainly not thousands. It also might be that you're a larger provider, but working with cohorts that come again in naturally small sizes. So perhaps a cohort of mature learners or a cohort of care experienced pupils who, again, typically will come in the kind of tens or hundreds, but not the thousands that might be needed to run a large scale randomized control trial or to employ a quasi-experimental design. Perhaps less salient at the moment is the complexity or difficulty of running multi-intervention programs or larger complex programs where we're trying to affect multiple outcomes at once and disaggregate the impact that different activities have on different outcomes. And again, this is an area that we hope these small N or small cohort methodologies will be able to help with. And then finally, cost and resourcing is something we hear a lot in terms of it being a challenge to RCTs and QEDs. I recognize that. I think that's definitely the case for many providers. I think I would just a bit of a caveat or a caution here that actually in producing this small N guidance and starting to conduct some pilot impact evaluations with small cohorts, what we're finding is that they're not necessarily quicker or cheaper or require less resources than running an RCT or a quasi-experimental design. I think arguably in some cases the kind of net cost is similar, particularly if you have the in-house kind of expertise or data collection capacity to run an RCT. So we will unpack that further as we go, but that's something to bear in mind as we talk about small N today. So what you can see on screen here is a very simple and kind of rapid history of the project so far. We have been working on this since May last year, so kind of over 12 months now, coming up for a year and a half. And we started with a sector consultation. So NEON conducted this consultation. Some of you on the call may have actually been part of that early scoping and consultation phase. And this was about understanding the barriers or challenges that providers in the sector face when trying to produce causal evidence, so that we could make sure that we were embedding this guidance with a realistic view of how people were currently experiencing the evaluation journey. We then moved on to a methodology review. So this was led by Chris and Julian, and we spent about 9 months or so developing what we've ended up calling a sort of technical report, which gives you a very good and kind of comprehensive grounding in both the theoretical and methodological challenges, of impact evaluation, and then an overview of the 8 small cohort methodologies that we ended up producing guidance on. We then took that technical report and did what we call a kind of translation phase. So we spent 3 months or so translating the large technical report into a series of web pages, downloadable resources and booklets. Julian worked on case studies to try and bring these methodologies to light in the HE context. And we will give you at the end of today's session a bit of an overview and kind of information about how to access that translated guidance. We're currently in what we're calling the pilot phase. So we are conducting 6 pilot impact evaluations with HE providers in the sector at the moment, using the small cohort or small N methodologies. And again, I am going to give you just a brief overview of those 6 pilots at the end of the session today. But before we get into that, I'm gonna hand over to Chris initially, who is going to give you an introduction to the small N impact evaluation methodologies.
Thanks, Rain. That's great. Right, I'm just going to share my screen. And hopefully, yeah, that's okay. Rain, have I got the right screen up there? Yeah, thumbs up.
Yeah,
Lovely.
got that.
So I'm going to try and talk through in a little bit more detail then the idea of small N impact evaluation, what it is, why it's different to more traditional forms of impact evaluation. And I'm also then going to try and give you a bit of a sense of how the guidance we've put together works. I'm not going to get heavily into individual methodologies here. As you'll see from the guidance, there's quite a few different methodologies that fall into this broad group of small N. So what we're trying to do here is give you an overview rather than talk about individual types of approach. This is roughly what I'll try and get through then. So to try and just talk through this kind of challenge we have around evaluation, impact evaluation, and then give you an overview of what it is that the small N methods offer. So thinking about the challenge, clearly, I mean, as Rain's already said, there's a growing interest in this idea of a what works agenda. What is it that works in tackling particular social problems? In our case, we're talking about issues around widening participation and student access, etc. But you know, that's a broader agenda. The what works agenda is present in most areas of social policy, and there are what works centres like TASO operating in areas like education, social care, criminal justice, etc. The what works agenda places a lot of emphasis on trying to understand what the impact is of an intervention and trying to make a causal link between interventions and outcomes. And that's really at the heart of the idea of the what works approach. And traditionally, that's been done using counterfactual impact evaluations. So sometimes randomized controlled trials, sometimes other kinds of evaluation that involve an intervention and a control group. And I'll just say a little bit more about those later. But there's a challenge with those kind of methodologies. As Rain said, one problem is that programs are often complex and they often operate in complex settings, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. We also have this issue that quite often, particularly in this sector, programs are relatively small. There are a small number of cases, a small number of students maybe, or pupils, or classrooms, or schools involved, and therefore it's hard to do those traditional types of impact evaluation. And then sometimes, of course, programs are rolled out very rapidly, and it's then hard to set up a counterfactual impact evaluation, which requires a lot of forward planning and sort of really requires the program to be fairly fixed before the evaluation starts. And so there's a kind of an underlying problem here, really, which is that counterfactual impact evaluation is very good at sort of making a link between an intervention and an outcome and making a causal link, but it does it in what's sometimes called a black box approach. So it kind of tells you what goes in and whether it's linked to what comes out, but doesn't really tell you what's happening inside the black box. And so it's been suggested that these are methodologies that are good at describing what happens. Is there a relationship between this intervention and this outcome, but less good at explaining why there is a relationship. So good at causal description, not so good at causal explanation. And the complexity issue in particular is a really challenging one, I think, for the sector, and for many areas of social policy. And that's that we live in an incredibly sort of interconnected world where very often, pretty much always, interventions we're trying to implement are being implemented in quite complex systems. And we're using complexity here in its more technical sense. So a complex system is one that's made up of many diverse and interacting components. And there's a sense that the way in which relationships play out in those complex systems is non-linear, and some of the reactions we get within the system are non-proportionate to what came before. We also then have this idea that complex systems are often adaptive, which means that people in the system, organizations within the system, are constantly learning and adapting to what's happened already, and therefore the system's in a constant state of flux. So all of that places some real challenges on doing impact evaluation. This is just a useful sort of table that breaks down that idea a bit more and tries to sort of get across the difference between, if you like, things that are complicated and things that are complex. So, I mean, the example that's often used is that putting someone on the moon is complicated, raising a child is complex. There's a sort of a different category of challenge in those two different things. And so lots of things that we as evaluators look at, we might class as complicated. And if you look at the right-hand side of this figure, you can see some ideas that we might class as complicated. But sometimes we also have to deal with what is complex. And that requires maybe different approaches to impact evaluation. So those are sort of some of the reasons why we really need to think about a broader array of impact methodologies than simply the traditional randomized controlled trial or similar counterfactual impact evaluations. And this is where the small n comes in. So the small n evaluations, first of all, rely on a small number of cases, hence the small n in the name. And of course, those cases can be many different things. They're not always going to be individual people. They might be institutions, classrooms. Some of the small n methods are used in political history, for instance, where the case is a country. So the case is not always a person, but the point is that whatever the case is, there are not many of them. And these are a set of methodologies that are potentially more sensitive to this idea of complexity. They're better able to take account of the complexity we often see as we implement interventions and then try to evaluate their impact. So also then helpful where maybe there's an emergent quality to those interventions. Maybe the intervention, the program is still in a state of development as we start to evaluate it, and there's a sort of an element of emergence or adaptation going on within the system in response to it. So these are evaluation approaches that can start to sort of tackle or address some of those issues. So in the guidance, we developed this taxonomy. It's based on previous work, in particular the work of Stern and colleagues who published an influential paper in this field back in 2012 that was originally commissioned by Department for International Development. And we've sort of built on that. And what we're trying to do here is to give a sense not only of a range of different approaches to impact evaluation, but to then also try to think a bit about what underpins those different approaches. So as a starting point, it's useful to make a distinction between what we have on that top row, effects of causes and causes of effects. So at a very high level, we can recognize that there are approaches to evaluation that focus on the effects of causes, and these are what the traditional counterfactual impact evaluations do. So they tend to depend on the difference between two groups of cases that are otherwise identical, except for the intervention that's being implemented. And the basis of making claims about causality is on being able to understand and measure that difference and recognize that that difference is a difference between an intervention being present or not being present. Whereas when we think about causes of effects, we recognize that the relationship between an intervention and outcomes is different. And we have two main types of causes of effects in the typology that we've developed. Generative causation. So for those of you who are familiar with realist evaluation, this is a model that underpins realist evaluation. And then multiple causation, which is the idea that there are many causes of a particular outcome that we might be interested in. And obviously, when we're talking about complex systems, very often we can't simply say our intervention caused an outcome. Our intervention will be one factor in causing an outcome. So that's a sort of a challenge. So I'm just going to sort of go back up a minute to that taxonomy. So what I'm going to do now is just try to sort of unpick a little bit. First of all, the distinction between the left and the right-hand side of the taxonomy. So what's happening in the sort of traditional evaluation methodology as opposed to the small n methods. And then I'm going to focus in a bit on what the methods in the grey box, the bottom right-hand corner or quadrant here. And those are the small n impact methodologies that we've looked at. So that's how I'm sort of going to progress through this. So let me start. Oops, left the build on that. Let me start then with the idea of counterfactual frameworks. So the traditional approach to understanding whether an intervention or a program has caused an outcome is to do a randomized controlled trial. And here's a sort of simple stylized version of a randomized controlled trial here. And in a randomized controlled trial, we basically have an intervention group and a control group. So the intervention group get the treatment, the program. The control group either get nothing, so that would be possibly a placebo, or they get something else, normally the next best thing or business as usual. It's quite unusual in social sciences that we use placebos as such. So essentially, if we're doing a randomized control trial, we're going to randomly allocate people to those two different groups. If it's not a randomized control trial, but a different type of counterfactual impact evaluation, we might not be able to randomize, but we'll still try to create two groups that are approximately the same. And then essentially what we're going to do is we're going to look at the outcome of interest before the intervention and after the intervention, and we're going to look at the difference between the two measures, and that's going to be the average treatment effect, the difference between the two groups. So there's an underlying philosophy behind that approach, which I won't try and get into now, but that's very much been the way that traditional impact evaluation has been thought of. It's very much about this idea of intervention group, control group, and the difference between the outcomes for those two groups. And if we set our evaluation up correctly, if we control potentially for things that might influence what's happening in those two groups effectively, ideally through randomization, then if we see a difference between those two groups, we can be confident that the difference is due to the intervention, not due to other things, not due to other factors, and therefore we can be confident that we're seeing an impact and that we can say that our intervention caused the impact. But as we said, we often can't do that kind of evaluation. So possibly a model that people here will be fairly familiar with, because it's quite widely used in the sector already, is the idea of a realist evaluation. So realist evaluation is based on the idea that there is a different model of causation in the social sciences. So whereas on the left-hand side of our typology, causation is based on the idea of a successionist model, which is associated with ideas from people like Hume, and essentially assumes that, very crudely, that causation is external to people, that forces impinge on people and change the way that they behave or they view the world. Realists favour something that's called a generative causation model, which assumes that causation is much more of an internal concept. It's internal to people because people have their own understandings of the world, they have their own purposes and their own goals. And so we have to understand causation differently. So because people are fundamentally different to things like chemicals in a test tube or atoms in a physics experiment, we have to recognize that there's a fundamental difference between a traditional model of causation, which is really the sort of model of causation as science that randomized controls trials draw on, and a model that's more appropriate to thinking about people and the way in which people change behaviors. And alongside that idea of a different model of causation, realist evaluators recognize there's also a different understanding of an intervention. So again, the intervention isn't something that happens to people, in the sense that, you know, if we set up some balls on a billiard table or a snooker table, and we hit the white ball and it crashes into one of the other balls, it will sort of go off at a particular direction and angle according to how hard we hit it, and friction and air pressure and whatever other sort of laws of physics might be in play. Social programs don't work like that. They don't simply kind of create mechanical responses in people. People choose whether or not they want programs to work. They make choices. They have a perception of what's happening to them, and they make choices, sometimes constrained choices, but nevertheless they make choices. And so social programs programs that we're interested in higher education are fundamentally different from the kind of interventions that maybe people look at in, say, medicine. And so we need to have a different approach here. And so the realist model not only has a different model of causation, it also has a different way of understanding what a program is. And if we take those kind of ideas, that then starts to give us a different set of ways of doing evaluation. So in this case, if we sort of follow the taxonomy down to the bottom, it will lead us to things like realist evaluation, for example. So in a realist evaluation, realists try to understand what they call context, mechanism, outcome configurations. They try to understand the relationship between the context within which a program happens, the mechanisms of change that the program triggers, and then the outcomes that leads to. And so the view of a realist evaluator is that you can't understand whether or not a program leads to particular outcomes without understanding what the mechanisms are that are being triggered and what the context is within which all of that's happening. So it's a different way of doing evaluation, different understanding of what social evaluation, social research looks like. But if we keep sort of moving on and move a bit further over to the right of the taxonomy, we've then got some small n methods that draw on slightly different ideas about causation. So in particular, the idea of contribution. So again, in traditional evaluation, we assume that there is a particular relationship between the intervention we're looking at and the outcome that's being created or delivered. And we might term that the idea of attribution, that the intervention, that the outcome can be attributed to the intervention. But in a complex system, such as we work, we recognize that very often, as I said before, programs don't simply lead to an outcome, they contribute to an outcome. The causal claim is a bit more complicated than simply saying, if you do this program, you get that outcome. The program will be one of a number of different factors that might lead to an outcome. And so we need to understand not just whether or not the program is related to the outcome, but what its contribution is relative to other things that are happening. So a contribution-based approach doesn't really focus on single cause and effect. It focuses on the idea that there are probably many causes of a particular effect that we're interested in. And so again, fits very well with this idea of complexity in systems. So that then leads us to evaluation designs that are much more focused on mixed methods. So whereas randomized controlled trials and similar evaluation designs tend to be driven primarily by quantitative methods, small n methods much more reliant on a mix of methods. So there might well be quantitative data in the mix, but they're also going to draw on qualitative research, whether that's interviews or observations or stories that participants tell about their experiences. Lots of different ways to collect qualitative data, but there's going to be almost certainly qualitative data, because we need that qualitative data to help us understand what's happening at the level of a particular case. And that then leads into the potential for different types of case-based methods or small n methods. So we might also make a useful distinction between methodologies that are primarily focused on comparisons between cases. So within the guidance that we've set out, qualitative comparative analysis, QCA is the obvious example of that. Or we have methodologies that focus primarily within a case, and so process tracing, elimination theory, general elimination methodology are some of these sort of examples of that. So again, we have sort of different approaches here. How we choose our approaches is very much driven by the kind of questions that we want to answer. So when we think about traditional impact evaluations, randomized controlled trials, etc., the sort of classic question they ask is, what was the additional or net change caused by the intervention, or how much of the observed outcome can be attributed to the intervention? So they tend to sort of ask those kinds of questions, whereas a lot of the small n methodologies are asking slightly different questions. So they're asking questions around the difference an intervention made and under what circumstances it made that difference, what the important context was in the change that occurred, why was the intervention successful in making a difference, and what mechanisms did it use or did it draw on to make that difference. So there's slightly different questions being asked here sometimes, and so quite often the choice of our methodology is not simply going to be driven by the fact that we only have a few cases, that we have small n. It's also going to be driven by the fact that we want to answer slightly different types of questions questions that are maybe more meaningful in a complex system where change is much more uncertain and much more contingent on context. It's also worth just pointing out that quite often with these small n methodologies, these small cohort case study approaches, it's quite common to combine methods. So if you look at the literature, quite often you'll see that, for instance, QCA might be used alongside realist evaluation or process tracing, that process tracing might well be combined with elements of contribution analysis. So it's quite common to sort of draw in several of these methodologies alongside each other. And that obviously adds to the sort of depth of understanding that can be created within a case that's being examined. Also, though, raises some challenges. There's going to be some issues around conceptual clarity. If you think back to the typology that I started with, some of these methodologies draw on different understandings of cause and effect and have slightly different understandings of how the social world works. So if we start mixing them, we've got to ask ourselves, well, are we being consistent in our underlying ideas about how we generate knowledge in the social sciences and how we understand that knowledge? It can also, of course, make for very complicated and complex evaluations. So that raises questions for whether or not we can get the right group of evaluators together to do the evaluation, and how we manage the evaluation so that we gather the right data at the right points and ensure that data that's collected meets the needs of different methodologies. It can also make reporting quite complex if we have maybe 2 or 3 quite complex methodologies in play. That's going to make the findings potentially quite hard to communicate. So combining methods, not always straightforward, but that tends to be an approach that these methodologies tend to adopt, to sort of sometimes use more than one at a time. You've probably already got a sense of some of the limitations, and Rain obviously touched on these as well. But so just to sort of summarize some of the limitations then. First point is that a lot of these methodologies, most of these methodologies, do not quantify the size of an impact in the same way that a randomized controlled trial or a counterfactual impact evaluation does. So the answer at the end of one of these evaluations is not generally going to be this intervention reduces attrition from university by 10%, or it widens participation by X%. That's generally not going to be the kind of answer you're going to get. The answer you're going to get is going to be a more nuanced piece of sort of narrative that explains the relationship between a program and the outcomes that have been generated, and how confident we are of the causal relationship between those outcomes and the intervention we're interested in. So it's going to be a slightly more complex set of messages coming out at the other end of the evaluation. It's also one thing that really struck us as we did the review of the use of these methodologies, and based on some of our own experience of using these methodologies, is that, as Rain said, these are not simple resource light approaches to doing evaluation. And that's really, there's sort of 2 dimensions to that. The first is that because these are quite intensive case-based methodologies that really involve a deep understanding of the case, the evaluator needs to have quite a deep knowledge of the program that they're looking at and the context within which that program is being implemented. And so their knowledge of the program is inevitably going to take time to build up. They're going to have to really know that program well and be able to spend time understanding that program. So that's not always straightforward for the evaluator, but of course then it also places quite considerable burdens on the program being evaluated, because again, the sort of data collection side of this is going to quite often involve quite in-depth qualitative data. But also what we've found as we've used some of these methodologies is that they really do require quite a strong ongoing relationship between the evaluator and the evaluand, the subject of the evaluation, because quite often in what's happening in these methodologies is that you're building a sort of a theory as a starting point, and then you're testing that theory and refining the theory, and then going back and testing it again. So you're going through a series of stages, and at each stage you quite often need to go back to the program that you're looking at to gather additional data, or look at a different perspective, or test a different hypothesis. So it places quite a burden on the program as well quite often. So I think it's really important to stress that these are not low cost or low skill alternatives to traditional counterfactual impact evaluations. To sort of finish up with from my side, just a little bit on the guidance, and Ray's going to talk more about this. So the guidance has been published. At the heart of it, we've got this kind of typology, if you like. So although the primary focus of the guidance is on the methodologies in the grey box in the bottom right-hand quadrant of this typology, we do also spend a bit of time at the beginning of the guidance just looking at what we mean by traditional effects of causes evaluations, randomized controlled trials, etc., so that we can be really clear on what the difference is between those traditional models and the different set of evaluation methodologies we're setting out. So you'll find that the first part of the guidance is essentially a kind of essay, I guess, that sort of explains how traditional impact evaluation works and why it might have its limitations, and hence why you might need an alternative set of methodologies and what those key differences are. Then quite a large part of the guidance then takes us through each of those methodologies in that grey box. So for each methodology, we've got an overview, trying to sort of give you a simple outline of what's involved. We've tried to then take you through the key steps of the methodology. Some of the methodologies have fairly standard steps. What's been written about them and the way they've been used gives us the ability to set out a fairly consistent, straightforward set of steps to use them. Others are less well documented, or they are broader approaches where there are different ways to implement them. And so in some cases, we can't give you a nice, neat set of steps, but you'll find that for some of them. Where it's likely that you might want to combine methodologies, we've also tried to highlight obvious combinations that you might use. And then we've got some resources that are required for you as evaluators. So we've tried to give you links to key texts, key sort of guidance documents that have been written about individual methodologies, or key sort of research papers that outline how the methodologies work. So we've tried to give you a set of resources. And then we have some case studies. Julian, did you want to talk a bit about case studies?
Yeah, so one of the things we wanted to do was to kind of make the different methodologies kind of approachable from, I mean, particularly my places as having worked in the sector on outreach and wide participation interventions. So we wanted to sort of play out, okay, if, and in most cases there aren't examples of these methodologies being used on the kinds of interventions that we're familiar with, what would it look like if we played out the theory on a hypothetical WP intervention? So to create some sort of sense of consistency, I invented a bunch of interventions using the same seed, which was Barkat's theory of change for a academic development program at the University of Birmingham. So she's kind of he's published the thinking around the program, the development theory of change. And then with that as a starting point, I replicated the methodological steps, imagining what would happen if you ran that intervention through these forms of evaluation. And I think they're intended as sort of placeholders until we do have examples of these methodologies being used in the wild and with actual interventions, at which point they will be rooted in more of a reality than a slight sense of invention. Thanks,
Julian. So yeah, I mean, the case studies are really useful. I think they really bring to life what in some cases are some quite complicated methodologies. So I think the case studies are definitely a useful point of reference. So I definitely recommend looking at those. Also, just to say, we also spent a little bit of time just thinking about roughly what we thought the resources were required for different evaluation methodologies to be used, both in terms of the kind of skill set evaluators would need, but also some idea of the kind of resource that might be required for these evaluations to be used. I mean, that's about it from me. That's hopefully just giving you an overview of what we've done and roughly what we mean by small n, or these small cohort evaluation methodologies, and the sense that there are quite a few of them out there. So, you know, in conclusion, I think that the key takeaway really is that whereas when we think about impact evaluation, we tend to think about some fairly well developed, tried and tested methodologies like randomized controlled trials and other types of counterfactual impact evaluation. There are other methodologies out there that also allow us to look at the impact of an intervention or a program that don't need large numbers of cases and that may often be better placed to understand some of the complexity and the context within which programs take place. But as you've probably seen, small n methods are not just an alternative to traditional counterfactual impact evaluations. Sometimes you might well use them prior to doing a traditional counterfactual impact evaluation because they help to answer exploratory questions about the why and the how, which might precede a larger scale rollout of a program and an eventual test using a randomized controlled trial, for example. So they're not necessarily simply alternatives. They might be part of a sequence of evaluation, and in some cases they will be the more appropriate way to do the evaluation because they will answer the kinds of questions that people want answering better than a randomized controlled trial can do. That's pretty much it. Just to say, obviously, hopefully you've had a chance to look at the guidance, but if you're sort of wanting to get an overview of these approaches, these broad approaches, three papers or sources I'd recommend as good starting points beyond our guidance would be the most recent version of the Magenta book, which is published every few years by central government and is the central government's guide to doing evaluation. The most recent version of it, published in 2020 and available online, has a specific chapter on handling complexity in evaluation and does make reference to many of the methodologies I've been talking about as means to address complexity. And then really influential paper, Stern and colleagues, published in 2012, which was a sort of a really in-depth review of a lot of these kind of methodologies and the ideas that sit behind them. And then slightly more accessible maybe, but also useful, a paper by White and Phillips, again available online, open access, looking at this issue of how small n can help us address cause and effect when we only have small cohorts to draw upon. And I think at that point I will stop, so I'll hand back over to Rain.
Wonderful, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Julian, for your presentation. I can see some questions beginning to filter in, so please do continue to drop your questions in the chat function and we will come to those in a moment. I'm just going to quickly reshare my screen. And I wanted to give you a very brief overview of just how to find the guidance on our website and the different available resources. So won't take 5 minutes and then we can get straight into the Q&A. I can see that some people do need to leave at 2, so hopefully we can start to answer some questions by then. Chris has touched on this, but just to show you what the guidance looks like and where to find it. So we've got the kind of longer or more comprehensive technical report. This can be downloaded as a PDF and saved, and you can come back to that. We also then have a series of web pages. So this is just copy or text that exists on the TASO website, offering an introduction to small n impact evaluation generally. There's a page on causation that just briefly tries to unpick or explain what exactly we mean by causation or causal inference. And then just a broad overview to impact evaluation that touches on the taxonomy, the kind of first figure that Chris presented with 2 halves. And then we have a series of what I've been calling downloadable booklets or kind of downloadable resources. So for each of the methodologies, of which there are 8 in total, you can download a specific booklet just on that methodology. So if you had identified that you thought realist evaluation or contribution analysis was potentially suitable for the program or intervention that you're wanting to evaluate, you can just hone in on that one resource and then access all the case studies and relevant steps that methodology includes. In terms of finding this, you may or may not be familiar with the evaluation guidance section of TASO's website. So there's a whole kind of subsection of evaluation pages. You can see here on screen that the impact evaluation with small cohorts just sits on that main page. So it's alongside the pages on randomized control trials or quasi-experimental designs. And then you can kind of self-navigate and click through all of those pages to identify or find the methodology that you're particularly interested in. And once you have identified that, it will bring you to a specific online web page where you can download the materials bespoke to that exact methodology. So Our hope is that it's quite clear to navigate. Of course, if it isn't, please do let us know, because that's very helpful information for us. Or if anything doesn't make sense or you're having trouble navigating it, just get in touch. In terms of what next, I wanted to quickly touch on the pilot evaluations that we're currently running. We may have some of the pilot test sites or partners on this call. So we're working with 6 separate providers across the sector at the moment to run these 6 pilot impact evaluations. And just very briefly to go through what each of those are, because our plan is to turn these pilots into case studies. So Julian mentioned and referenced the case studies that we have produced, and they are currently fabricated versions, because we just don't have examples of these methodologies being used in higher education, or actually education generally at the moment. But they will be replaced over time with examples from the pilots that we're currently running. And I certainly, when I think about using small n methodologies, just want a really clear step-by-step, like how did someone else do it? And that's what we're trying to produce, basically. So the 6 areas we're focusing on is a realist evaluation of a intervention and outreach program that works with Gypsy, Roma and Traveller, WP young girls. A second realist evaluation that is going to be evaluating micro work placements. So these are kind of 30 or 40-hour work placements that intend to improve employment outcomes for students. We're then conducting a transformative evaluation, which is an iteration of most significant change. And that's going to be evaluating an initiative called Student Colleagues, which again is an employment-related intervention where students work alongside their academic or administrative staff to gain work experience and hopefully improve employment outcomes. We're then using QCA, so qualitative comparative analysis, to evaluate a program called Jumpstart, which is an outreach program for mature students. And then finally, we have 2 contribution analysis evaluations happening. One as part of an arts higher education provider, and this is called the Creative Pathways program, so an outreach program to get students who are interested in studying the creative arts into a specialist arts college, of course focused on students that come from a disadvantaged or underrepresented background. And then finally, a contribution analysis of something called the HE Tutorial Supervisor, which is an initiative or a role set up to support students who have a physical disability or a learning difficulty. So we're kind of phase 1 tipping into phase 2 of these pilot evaluations. We've sort of done the setup and theory of change development, and we're going to be launching into kind of data collection and analysis over the autumn term, so the coming months, with a hope to kind of report and wrap up in the new year. So a bit of a kind of watch this space, in that we will have hopefully further translation of what can currently still feel like quite complex guidance. I'm aware of that. I do want to kind of note that we're aware that it still can feel complex to some people, and the translation and the piloting will continue over the coming months. So I think let's get stuck into the Q&A, and I can see some questions coming through. Let's start with a question from someone who needs to log off in the next kind of 5 minutes or so. So they ask, great presentation, thank you, Chris and Julian. So complex evaluations often result in complex findings, which can be frustrating for evaluators or researchers within the sector. Is it a better strategy to accept that researchers cannot evaluate and answer all questions, and prioritize evaluation questions based on what's needed and most valued? Chris, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Definitely. And I hope what we've tried to do in the guidance is place quite a lot of emphasis on thinking through what the evaluation question is that you're trying to answer. So even if you're broadly interested in impact evaluation, you know, did our program, did our intervention make an impact? Within that, there are still specific questions you might want to answer, and so we've got quite a lot in the guidance on the sort of selection of questions and how the selection of questions might then lead you to particular methodologies. But I absolutely agree, trying to sort of focus in on a particular question is definitely going to help in the communication of the outcomes. And it's also worth saying that the way a lot of these methodologies work is that they start with theory of change. So you'll find in the guidance we start with outlining our particular thinking on how a theory of change should look in order to service these kinds of methodologies. And so within the theory of change, again, you're often going to identify some very specific mechanisms of change or relationships that you want to address between intervention and outcomes. And again, that's going to help you narrow down the scope of the evaluation. So I would absolutely agree with that.
Super, thank you. A slightly different question then. We have someone asking, are these pilot evaluations going to incorporate any traditional or large N methods? And might this be a good way of triangulating the evidence for causality? I can start and then I will hand over to both Chris and Julian, but the short answer is that we're currently not running these small N pilots alongside larger scale randomized control trials or quasi-experimental designs. That actually is a kind of pipeline plan for the future. To be very candid or frank, we just didn't have time, and we wanted to get on with translating the guidance as quickly as possible over this autumn term. So for now, the small N pilots are just small N pilots. But I wonder, Chris, maybe over to you again, if you could talk a little bit about how these small N methodologies have been run alongside randomized control trials or combined with large N methodologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, that other people have done that to some extent. So, for instance, there are, and it's in our sort of typology that we've mentioned it in the overall typology. So, for instance, there are a group of researchers, particularly working around health and healthcare, who have started to combine realist methodologies with RCTs and talked about realist RCTs or an RCT plus design as an example. So, some people are trying to combine some of these methodologies with traditional methodologies. There are also examples of people, running both simultaneously, not that many. We've done it once or twice ourselves, so I can talk about that most easily. And the best example I can think of is a lot of these small N methodologies also kind of link back to review methodologies, evidence review methodologies. And we, a few years ago, ran a traditional systematic review of an intervention. We were looking at prison education and its impact on prison outcomes. We ran a traditional systematic review, and then we separately ran a realist review in order partly to compare how two different approaches to answering the same question and using evidence in different ways would give us different answers. And for us, that was quite informative in sort of thinking through how the two methodologies would work differently. And I think other people have done similar things. So there are a few examples out there. If other people have examples, always keen to see them because I haven't come across loads, but there are some.
Super, thank you, Chris. Julian, this might be one for you to start with, and we can also chip in. So an anonymous attendee is asking how we choose the kind of the right or the correct small N methodology for each of the pilots specifically within HE.
Yeah, and I think as Chris suggested, it depends on the questions we want to answer. And I think, having read through the guidance and spent a lot of time thinking about it, I can see the way that different methodologies might cluster in particular groups. And obviously, Chris presented a typology to suggest that. And it comes down to what you want to get out of the evaluation, really. I think a number of them appeal to me personally because they're quite thinky, and they kind of demand a concentrated attention to a theory of change and then to elaborate that theory of change as you go through. So you wind up with a lot more knowledge and thought put into the kind of the mechanisms that underpin your interventions. So that's something that appeals, but there are other evaluation questions you might want to answer that might be more appropriately answered through, say, QCA, which will give you a sort of a representation of how the different components of your intervention produced the results you were aiming for. So I think it's quite a difficult decision to make. The table that Chris included is really helpful, just to work through that with the primary question involved. But it's I kind of, as I was learning about these, I kind of felt like a bit like a child in a sweet shop sometimes, and I want to try all of them and I want to do more now. But that's not very sensible. So
thank you very much. And yeah, I do recommend the kind of table or tool that comes quite early on in the longer report that will guide you through not quite like a decision tree, but a similar kind of ethos in that it will guide you through and help you identify a suitable methodology for the questions that you're trying to answer. So we have a question that came early on from another anonymous attendee, and they're asking, should we not consider adopting small n methodologies for all evaluation, regardless of the size or scale? Chris, I might come to you to begin with for that.
Yes, I think there's a lot to be said for that. So even if you are ultimately planning to do a large scale randomized control trial or something similar, it might quite often be that at the point, there is a point in a program when a program is maybe less fixed and still going through a developmental phase, where you might want to start asking some questions about impact. And quite often what happens, and we often get asked to do evaluations in this scenario, is people go straight to a randomized control trial or a counterfactual impact evaluation. And then the challenge for the evaluator is that they're trying to evaluate something which requires the methodology to be very fixed and clearly set out and is consistent through the period of the evaluation, when in actual fact it's still possibly still developing. And so I think there's a very strong argument for saying that these methodologies often should precede those large N fixed evaluation designs, because they give you opportunities to start to think about impact and impact related questions earlier in the process of a program or an intervention being developed. So there's a lot to be said for that. So as we've said, we don't necessarily see them as just simply as alternatives to large N, and they may well precede what eventually becomes a large N evaluation.
Thank you very much. That's a nice segue into another question we have about kind of challenges and benefits. And as Chris says, I think we're hoping that these can be a kind of value add, I guess, these small n methodologies to what the kind of more traditional counterfactuals. And of course, there are pros and cons in the most simplistic way to both. And what I would like to ensure is that we get to a point where we're basically choosing the best tools for the evaluation challenge at hand. So Luke, and one of our attendees, is asking, could you elaborate on the additional challenges and benefits you see in deploying these methodologies for evaluation with large N or complex interventions? So I think, Chris, this is getting a little bit at your one of your final slides on limitations. What do small N methodologies kind of not give us that a more traditional counterfactual design might?
Yeah, so in terms of the kind of result, there is going to be a difference in the sense that we're not going to get a nice neat number at these evaluations generally, although some of them could potentially give us that. It's generally not the approach they're going to give us. So we're going to get something that's more descriptive, more contextual, and possibly therefore harder to generalize from, because obviously a lot of these interventions are based on the idea that we need to foreground context when we're doing social science research. And obviously if we're foregrounding context, it's hard to then generalize in the same way as you might from a randomized control trial, for example. So generalization is going to be trickier. Explaining the findings is going to be trickier potentially, because it's going to be more contingent on context and exactly how mechanisms have been deployed. So harder to sometimes explain that as well as to generalize from it. I think it kind of also links to another question that we had from Jessica Benson Eglinton, who talks about or asks about the deeper level of knowledge a program with these methods that an evaluator needs to look at programs using these methods. And I think there's another sort of limitation there, which is that sometimes evaluators either come into a program fairly late in the day, when it's hard to build that deep knowledge because a lot of the programs already happened, or it's in the past, or there is limited data available to them, or there's limited appetite for prolonged engagement with the people who are doing the program. So again, some of the limitations are about the results, the findings, what comes out of these designs, but some of the limitations are also to do with how we do them and the fact that they do require quite intensive engagement with program participants. That said, of course, some of these methodologies can be used retrospectively. So, for instance, process tracing, a lot of its early development was in areas like critical history, where it was being used retrospectively. So it's not always the case that in these evaluations you have to do a sort of an immersive piece of work. Sometimes you will use them retrospectively, but even if you are using them retrospectively, you're still going to need quite rich data in order to make them work.
Super, thank you, Chris. We have a couple of questions that I'm going to kind of roll into one around the reporting and dissemination of evaluations that have used small n methodologies. So broadly, these two people are asking, how can we report on or disseminate findings from small n studies that take into consideration the kind of bias towards the what works approach or quantitative findings? Julian, I might come to you for early reflections on that. I think the only thing I would say to kind of prefix the conversation is, I guess this is quite new. We really haven't used these small n methodologies in higher education before. So I think it's fair to say that we are, as a sector, probably all learning about these at a similar pace and rate as we go. But yeah, Julian, any reflections from a sort of HE perspective?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, I'm really excited about the potential for a lot of these methodologies to generate, if not generalizable, knowledge that can be adapted for different contexts and in different processes. So I think the sort of, I don't know whether the question refers specifically to sort of publication in journals and, you know, the risk of you know, the outcomes being kind of marginalized in particular journals that may not be read so much, but as a kind of a sector and a collaborative network and people who share an interest in improving our practice and our evaluation practice, I think my sense is that the sector as a whole would be very, very keen and excited to hear that, you know, and to learn about the outcomes of these evaluations as we develop together and get more experience with using these methodologies. So from a kind of internally facing perspective, I don't anticipate that, you know, I anticipate a lot of interest in the findings of these methodologies as they're used.
Super, thank you very much. So we have a couple of quite practical questions, probably quick to answer. Someone is asking, an anonymous attendee is asking, could we recommend a publication that has a good example of a write-up for contribution analysis? Again, in terms of higher education, because it's quite, the employment of these methodologies was quite new. I'm wondering, Chris, if you have an example from work outside HE.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I've asked this same question myself because I've just been doing a piece of contribution analysis on another project, and it's been quite hard actually to find good write-ups. So again, if people have them, please let me know. I'm on LinkedIn, always keen to hear from people who are doing this kind of work. However, what I have used and found useful is some of the papers that Maine, who is the sort of person who really articulates this model, put out. In particular, he had a nice briefing paper, which I think came out in 2008, which is referenced, and there's a link to it in the guide. And in that, he does provide a worked example of a program and how contribution analysis would be applied to it and how you would sort of report the findings. So I would start with Maine and his 2008 briefing.
Super, thank you very much. And then I might come back to you, Chris, with another quite practical question. How small is too small? So I'm thinking of a small project with follow-up focus groups and looking for an example that is, sorry, the example is going to be very limited numbers being involved. Okay, so some of these methods work with a single case. So in the sense, there isn't a too small. The key issue here is what is the case? So the case isn't necessarily an individual. The case might be, you know, a classroom or a group of students or a, you know, a year group or a lecture theatre. You know, the case is not necessarily going to be an individual. And very often in these methodologies, the case is not an individual. But a lot of them are based on the idea of a single case. Now, you might have several cases because, for instance, the piece of contribution analysis I've just been doing, we had 5 cases. Each case was essentially
a small team working in a different country but trying to do the same thing. And so we essentially viewed those as 5 cases. So they weren't individual team members, but each team was a case, and we essentially did the contribution analysis separately for 5 teams. So each one stood alone as a piece of contribution analysis, but then by having 5 pieces of contribution analysis and looking across them, we then were able to maybe generate a little bit more insight, because we were able to sort of point to some differences and some similarities, and sort of almost better understand the context and how context mattered, because we could see how context in one place led to some slightly different outcomes. So you might well only have a single case or a very small number of cases, but that's still viable for these kind of methodologies. Some of them require more cases. So QCA, I think, is typically done with, sort of 20, 30, 40 cases. And the issue there is about, having some variation within the cases so that you can sort of see different patterns within the cases that you have.
Super, thank you. And then we have a question about kind of skills and knowledge required. So someone is asking if, for someone who is moving away from the RCT methodology, what are the main challenges that they might experience? So what are the key research skills that are needed for working with small n designs? Again, Chris, I might come to you initially, if that's okay.
Okay, so a lot of these designs rely more on qualitative data. So I think then it's having really good qualitative skills, because sometimes I come across evaluations where it feels as though the view was that because it was talking to people, anyone can talk to people, so therefore anyone can do it. And I think that's always a mistake, because good qualitative research requires good qualitative research skills, and in particular that's things like great listening skills, reflective practice, and the ability to sort of think reflexively, and those are skills that need to be developed. Not everybody has them instantly at their fingertips, as well as then, of course, more practical skills about using particular interviewing techniques. Are you going to be using appreciative inquiry or some kind of particular model of interviewing that is designed to get certain types of information out of certain types of people in a way that is helpful to you and helpful to them. There's lots of sort of skills in a good qualitative researcher. So I think it's really important not to underestimate qualitative research. It's not just simply talking to people, and you do need to actually have a good training and a good experience of doing that. So I think that's really the key, is probably that building those qualitative skills. But then I think the other thing is that a lot of these evaluations, because they're sort of multi-method, and I prefer multi-method to mixed method because that always sounds a bit confused, but multi-method, again, you've got to sort of have that appreciation of what different types of data and different types of analysis offer you, and how that might, for instance, mean different approaches to sampling, either sampling cases or making selections of data within a case. Again, there's some sort of questions that you need to ask there. And so I think all of those require, a particular skill set, both in qualitative research, but also in that ability to negotiate kind of so-called mixed method research effectively.
Super, thank you. So we're coming to our kind of last couple of questions. We have a question about who, or from both of your experience, I might come to you first, actually, on this one, Julian, but from experience of using these methodologies, do you have an idea of who is more or less likely to buy into the small n methods, and what techniques have you found are useful in small n research proposals to make them more attractive?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the kind of, the issues we've been talking about is, why are we evaluating, who are we evaluating for, and what do we want to get out of the evaluations? So I've recently had a conversation actually with, to start scoping out an evaluation of a civic engagement intervention, and we got quite excited when we started talking about the potential to expand our understanding of the mechanisms by which the intervention would make a change. And the idea of a sort of a dynamic and evolving theory of change was something that really appealed to the people who run the intervention. But as we circled around the conversation, and I asked who were they evaluating for and what did they want to give that stakeholder, it turned out to be a kind of a return on investment kind of evaluation, which means that a lot of the kind of thinking about mechanisms and the things that make the difference were probably irrelevant to that stakeholder. So I think it's sort of scoping out that, you know, how is the evaluation going to be used? How will your stakeholders want to use the evaluation? And, you know, if it is a kind of, you know, what works return on investment kind of evaluation, then some of these methods may not be as useful to them as other causal methods.
Super, thank you. Is there anything you want to add there, Chris, in terms of who you experience? No, not to worry. I think we can begin to wrap up. So someone has a nice segue, just put a question to ask, are we going to share a copy of these slides and presentation? So yes, we will be. Anyone who has signed up, which obviously everyone on the call has, will receive a copy of the recording that we have produced today, and along with a copy of the PDF version of the slides. You will also receive a questionnaire, a kind of feedback questionnaire. It's really useful for us to receive feedback on the kind of level that these sessions are pitched at, and anything we can do to make them generally more accessible or easy and simple to follow. So please do take the time to fill out that questionnaire if you can. I think that just leaves it to me to say thank you very much to our two speakers, to both Chris and Julian, for the project generally, but also for your support today. It's really, really useful to hear from you both. And thank you to everyone who has attended and for your wonderful questions. It felt like a very productive Q&A just now. So thank you for that. I am going to stop sharing my screen and end the call. So we'll be in touch shortly with everyone. Thank you so much.